Hello folks, welcome to my YouTube channel Watercolor Impressions. In this video tutorial we are going to learn how to do dry technique in watercolors. I'm going to use the same scene from last week so we can see the difference between wet on wet and dry technique in watercolors. I'm also going to provide the reference as well as the drawing template. I highly recommend to draw from it, not to trace it, since I simplified the drawing as well as the painting for beginners. And let's get started. So in any watercolors, light wash the first wash. So for the sky, we're going to use Cobalt Blue. And I'm going to throw Cadmium Orange here and there to kill the monotonous of the sky, and it also gives really good colors for our sky, for the background. So I'm also collecting the bead and I want to take it all the way down, but we have to make sure we are not going over the houses, because the house on the roof we're going to have a different value. And you can also see I took that Cobalt Blue and I'm also painting on the houses as well. So the reason being, I want to kill the whiteness of the paper, and also it also creates a glow when we paint over it. So I'm also leaving some intentional highlights at the background so that it gives the viewers that there is something there, and we're just giving a suggestions for the viewer that there are some details exist in the background. So now let's jump on to the midground. For the midground, I'm going to mixing up Cerulean Blue, Cadmium Yellow, and I'm throwing a little bit of yellow ochre because I want to create that warmth in the midground because there's going to be a sunlight. And I'm also making sure that I'm not going over my horses. For the legs, I'm going over it because we're going to have a darker value for our horses, so I'm not worried about it. So I'm also taking that wash a little bit in the background to have some color variations. But as you can see, we have a beautiful transition from the background to the middle ground. So as it comes to the foreground, I'm increasing the pigment consistency. What I mean by that is more pigment, less water. And I'm also using burnt sienna and Cadmium Orange, which was left over in my palette, and I'm throwing in the foreground to have some color variations in our wash. So as you can see, I also going a little bit more pigment consistency in the foreground. So that creates a beautiful lead in, and it takes the viewers or the audience to our painting. Let's take some burnt amber and some water in it. I'm just splattering that in the foreground, so it creates the illusion of details in the foreground. So when people see it, it looks like thistle, flowers, you name it. So it gives a really good suggestion and details for a viewer and for our painting. Since we have some green in the brush, so I'm just throwing it in the midground, so as you can see. And I let it dry for a bit. And let's start with the background, and I'm using Cadmium Yellow, Cerulean Blue. And whenever we paint trees, I make sure that we paint the light of the trees first. So the lightest value first. And I'm also making sure that I'm not going over the roof. And I'm also breaking the edges here and there, so it kind of gives an illusion that it's a tree. And I'm also making sure, and we have to make sure that there is a little bit of color variation in our trees too. If you make a tree with the same color, it looks really dull and boring. And I'm also painting the trees really fast because we have to jump onto the mid-tones and the darker tones for our trees. And I also spread some water, so if I put some colors into it, so it blends in and it gives beautiful color variations in our trees. Let's add some midtones for our trees. So I'm mixing up Cadmium Yellow, Cerulean Blue, and Ultramarine Blue. So you can see the value is a little bit darker. Even though it looks darker now, when it dries out, it's gonna go to a lighter value. So I'm also making sure we're not going over the roof of the house because it's going to have a different color and value for our roof. So I'm also making sure making the edges broken up here and there because that gives an illusion of tree and it gives beautiful impressions as well. And I'm also aware of my highlights at the background, so I'm leaving that and I'm not painting over it. So now if you see, as soon as we add the midtone, it does look really flat. It looks like a single shape. So whenever we get into this problem, what we can do is we can take off some painting. You can use a brush or use a tissue paper and just take off some painting from your background. So as soon as I did that, you could see we didn't have this big flat shape for our background. So now I'm going a little bit darker because I want to have another value, darker value, and I also want to make sure that our house reads properly. So the one way to do is to create a contrast between the house and the background. So as soon as I put the darkest value in our background, you could see the house kind of become a focal point. And I'm taking the darker value in my brush and I'm just going from right to the left. Lucky for the sprayer, I'm just spraying some water. And let's jump onto the roof of the house now. For the roof of the house, I used a Cobalt Blue, a little bit of NeutralTint. Even though in the reference it's a little bit purple, but I tend to change colors as I please. These are the decisions you have to make as an artist, so it comes with practice. And I used to paint whatever's in my reference. Sometimes I change it because it just looks pleasing to my eyes. So you'll have your own vision when you paint. So make sure to have colors, whatever feels right to you. And I'm also want to create a darker value, so I'm throwing NeutralTint from top to the bottom, so that as it dries out, it gives a beautiful textures, for our houses. So I'm using Cobalt Blue for the house, and I'm trying to leave some highlights here and there. So it gives really beautiful details for our house. I'm also steadying my hand to make sure leave some highlights. And we also have to make sure that we are not going over the farmer. So he is our focal point too. So I'm taking a little bit of a darker pigment, NeutralTint, and I'm just and make sure it's running over our houses. So as soon as we add that darker tone, you can see there is plane started happening, the farm started happening in our house. So there's a difference between the front house and the back house. So I'm going a darker value of the house now. So it's better to add the darker value when it's wet, so it also gives a beautiful textures for painting too. So you can see that's a beautiful thing about watercolors. It paints by itself, you don't have to paint. And I'm also taking tissue paper and taking out some painting wherever windows are. I usually leave highlights, but for some reason I painted. So I want to make sure that I leave some highlights for our windows. As you can see in the reference, there is tons of details there, but since our house is in the background, so I don't spend more time on the background because it's just a background. And our focal point is the farmer and the horses, so I want to make sure that I'm spending more details on there. And I want to read, I'm thinking about the overall painting than just the house. So now I'm taking Cerulean Blue, Cadmium Yellow, and I'm going to start adding the shadows and at the background. So I have a little bit of darker value in the ground, and it also helps anchoring our house in the background too. So as soon as I added the darker value, you can see the house sits on the midground now. I'm also being aware that I'm not going over the horse, and I also create a little bit of shadows at the background, so the trees are peeking through in our midground. So I took burnt amber. I'm just adding exactly where the house anchors on the midground. So as soon as we add that midground, the darker value where the ground meets the midground, you can see the house sits on the ground now. Let's jump on to the fun part. Let's start detailing the horses. So for the horse, I'm using burnt amber and NeutralTint, and you can also see I'm going with the darker pigment because our horse is in the foreground. So whenever something is in the foreground, they tends to have a darker value, so that it brings in the front and it pushes the background further. So I'm also making sure that leave some highlights when I paint my horse because it's less work. We don't have to use a white paint after finishing our painting. So it's a similar process for the next horse. For the second horse, I'm introducing a little bit of burnt sienna and NeutralTint. So I want to mix it because I don't want both the horses to be looking identical. But you can see in our painting, everything is a dry technique. We never used any wet on wet principles here. Now I'm jumping out of the fencing. Fencing is really complicated. As you see in the reference, the fencing is super complicated. As we did on wet and wet to simplify it. I'm also being aware of my perspective and I'm simplifying it. I'm also painting it in a quick, confident way. So you can see, once I mark it, I marked it. I'm never going back there again in my strokes. But I'll make it skinnier or thicker, that's about it. So now let's jump on to the other focal point, our farmer. For the farmer, I'm going to use neutral tint for his legs, and for his cute dog, I'm going to use a neutral tint. It's just an impression. And for his face and neck, I'm using Cadmium Orange, and I'm using Cobalt Blue for his shirt. So now let's add some shadows. For shadows, I literally used Cobalt Turquoise and Cadmium Yellow and Cerulean Blue and a little bit of neutral tint in it because I want to have a darker value because the shadows are in the midground. So as soon as we add the shadows, you can see the painting came alive. I'm jumping onto those now. I'm also making the shadows look simpler too. Now we are almost at the end of our painting journey. So I'm using clean water in the foreground. So the reason being is when I paint over it, I'll get the blurry shadows. As you can see, I have the dry technique. And as it comes to the foreground, it gets blurrier. So it gives a really beautiful lead in so that it leads it into the painting. So I'm also using some dabble shadows, so it kind of gives an impression that there is trees, which is casting shadows in the midground and which peeks through the foreground. And I'm also adding some darker value by using neutral tint. I'm just taking it all the way in the foreground. And I'm also taking tissue paper, and I also want to create some textures, so I'm kind of taking off painting here and there, so it kind of gives an illusion like that. So now I squinted my eyes and I saw the reference, and I was kind of lacking some values. The values are not aligning on the reference. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to glaze over with Cobalt Blue. I'm also adding a little bit of burnt amber where the ground meets, so it kind of gives like some kind of like color variations in our painting. And in the background, I'm also taking a little bit of neutral tint, and I'm making the house a little bit darker, as you can see. I'm just bringing back some details because which got really light as it dries out. Now we are at the finishing stage, the detailing stage. So I'm going to take a white paint. So there's one thing I did. I made the highlight big on our farmer. So in order to fix it, I gave him a hat. So sometimes in your painting, if you make a mistake, try to come up with the creative solutions and just go with it. My vision was to have the farmer black hair, but I ended up giving a hat. So that detail ended up being really good on the farmer. So I left it as it is. And now I'm just using white paint to bring back some of the dark shapes at the background. And that's it, guys. It was nice painting with you folks. Let me know what you learned from this tutorial. And what's your favorite color in this painting? And what techniques have you learned today? And are we gonna use it in your part of your work? And if you have any other requests or subjects you want me to cover in watercolors, let me know in the comments or write me at watercolorimpressions@gmail.com. If you follow this tutorial and did a painting of this farmhouse, share it with me. I would love to check your artworks too. Thanks again for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, and comment below. And good luck with your painting, folks.